The night my sister introduced me as the harmless one, I felt something inside me crack. She didn't say it with anger, she said it with ease. The way people talk about furniture that never mattered. Everyone laughed, including my mother. No one noticed me stiffen. No one cared that I did. That was the moment I realized I could disappear from that room, from that family, from that entire version of my life, and not a single person would pause their conversation. My name is Georgia Harmon, and this is the story of how they finally learned who they were laughing at. The morning after the storm felt heavier than the night that came before it. I stepped onto the deck and let the first breath of cold air cut through my lungs. The kind that rises off the Great Lakes after hours of fighting wind and water. The steel railing beneath my hand was still cold from the night, and the mist hung thick enough to blur the line between sky and lake. My breath warmed the air for a moment before dissolving into the silver haze. My body ached in every place that mattered. The familiar throb that followed a 14-hour rescue. 27 people made it ashore alive. That knowledge steadied me long after my muscles had given up. The lake behind me was still restless, but Detroit was already waking. The glass towers along the waterline caught the pale light and threw it back in quiet flashes. The city wasn't romantic, but it was honest, and in its honesty, I'd always found a place for myself. No one here questioned the shape of my life, or why I lived it the way I did. No sideways looks. No reminders about what I was supposed to be. Out here, I wasn't measured against anyone. My phone buzzed the moment I stepped inside the cabin. A long string of messages lit the screen, all from my mother. Each one puncturing the small pocket of calm I'd managed to keep through the night. News about Annie's engagement, instructions about when to arrive, and then the familiar line telling me not to wear my uniform. There were no questions about where I had been or what I had spent the night doing. Her world was focused entirely on the celebration waiting in Charleston, not on the storm I had just climbed out of. I let the screen dim and set the phone down for a moment. These messages had become their own kind of weather, predictable, recurring, and never quite gentle. My mother had always worried someone might ask what exactly I did, and whether it sounded impressive enough beside Annie's life. Annie, with her polished charm, effortless success, and the way our mother's pride wrapped around her like a tailored coat. I had never begrudged my sister that, but I had learned to disappear so she could shine. Another message came in, this one from Annie, short and clipped, asking me to come but to keep quiet about what I did, as if talking about my life might disrupt the celebration, as if it might unsettle someone. I smiled to myself, a small, tired smile, and slipped the phone into my pocket. People understand only what they want to understand. I'd learned that long ago, back in my apartment. The silence was the same as always, orderly, sparse, lived in only by me. I hung my damp jacket, set my cap on the table, and glanced at the duty schedule. 3 days. Enough time to fly to South Carolina and stand where I was expected to stand. I leaned back in the chair and let the exhaustion settle into my bones. One more time. I told myself, just 3 days. I had no way of knowing how quickly that trip would reroute my entire life, or how many fault lines would finally split open the moment I walked into that engagement party. I only knew that something was waiting there, something years in the making, something I could feel pressing against me even now in the quiet, and whatever it was, I wouldn't be ready for it. I landed in Charleston under a harsh, blinding sun. The kind that made the air feel heavier with every breath. The brick streets reflected the light back at me. Too bright, too clean, too carefully arranged. After days surrounded by steel decks, storm spray, and engine oil, this city felt unreal pretty in a way that made me feel like an intruder. I dragged my suitcase through the hotel lobby, the wheels rattling sharply over polished stone. Before I could set it down, my phone buzzed with messages from my mother, warning me not to make anyone uncomfortable with talk of my work, reminding me that Annie was worried, and slipping in the old comparison that the Coast Guard lacked the polish of the Navy. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting it cut the way it always did, quiet but deep. I called Annie to confirm the time for the engagement dinner. She answered quickly, distracted, and told me to just show up on time. Then came the familiar request: keep the technical talk to a minimum, since Mason once knew someone from the guard who hadn't impressed him. She meant it as a precaution for the night, but it revealed what she really feared, that Mason might see me the same way she always had. I didn't argue. I never did. Later, while I changed to go out alone, an email from district headquarters appeared. The investigation into the Great Lakes rescue had been escalated. I stared at the words, feeling the heat of Charleston fade from my skin. The one part of my life that had never wavered was suddenly on unsteady ground. The next evening, the plantation house near the Ashley River shimmered under soft lighting, a perfect backdrop for Annie's dream celebration. Acoustic music floated through the air, mingling with the scent of flowers and river water. I adjusted my simple dress on the steps, doing exactly what I'd been asked, trying not to draw attention. Inside, I walked into a room that didn't notice me. Conversations spun around me, untouched by my arrival. It wasn't new, but it still settled into my chest with a familiar weight. My mother saw me and waved me over without a smile. She introduced me to a group of relatives with a dismissive gesture, calling me her older daughter who did some work out on the lake. A few polite laughs followed, soft but cutting. A well-dressed woman asked if I worked at the docks and whether it was fun or just paperwork. And before I could answer, my mother added that I'd taken a different path than Annie, but was doing fine being the word people used when they didn't know how to value something. An older man in a Navy Reserve suit watched me with a careful, knowing look, as if searching his memory for the story attached to my face. It was the only gaze in the room that didn't shrink me. Then Annie appeared, beautiful and polished, hugging me lightly before whispering her request not to bring up my work so Mason wouldn't feel awkward. I nodded, though the sigh inside me had become instinct. What I didn't know was that Mason would be the first person in that room to see me clearly, and that recognition would change everything. I stood in the center of the plantation house ballroom, surrounded by chandeliers glowing a soft gold, crystal glasses clinking, and conversations weaving together like a rehearsed script. Everyone seemed perfectly cast in their roles, moving with the easy grace of people accustomed to being admired. I felt like the extra who wandered onto the wrong set, wearing a simple dress among a crowd polished to perfection. The air around me hummed with confidence, yet none of it felt like mine. A man in a navy suit turned toward me with a pleasant, almost patronizing smile, and asked what I did in the Coast Guard, whether I taught swimming. He guessed, letting the question float out with a laugh. It wasn't loud enough to humiliate, just soft enough to diminish. Before I could answer, my mother placed a hand on his arm, as if they shared an inside joke, and explained that I did small tasks out on the water. But it was fine because Annie was the true pride of the family. The group responded with muted chuckles, polite and sharp at once, the kind of laughter that confirmed I had been placed exactly where they believed I belonged. While they laughed, the older Navy Reserve officer nearby didn't join in. He studied me with a narrowing gaze, as if searching his memory for a detail he couldn't quite catch. I felt his attention like a thin beam of light cutting through the dim assumptions filling the room. I answered in the calmest tone I could manage, offering a vague explanation about coordinating rescue operations. True, but bland enough to avoid raising questions. Another woman commented that hands-on work must be meaningful. I didn't argue. In a setting like this, honesty was treated as impolished behavior, and I'd learned to keep my truths small. Then Mason walked in. His handshake toward me was quick, courteous, and dismissive, as if reaching for a glass behind me. He started telling a story about a joint operation between SEALs and the Coast Guard, and without thinking, I corrected a tactical detail, shifting the vector from 315 to 298 to avoid the ice drift. For a moment, everything stilled. Mason's eyes sharpened, the commander's narrowed, and I felt the air shift. Mason finally asked if I'd helped direct that mission. I told him I'd been there. It was a simple answer, but it opened a door neither of us had expected. For the first time since I arrived, someone in that room looked at me with something other than amusement. Respect flickered across Mason's face, faint but unmistakable. The tension didn't break, it deepened. Something was turning beneath the surface, pulling every thread tighter. I sensed the shift before anyone else did. The room didn't get quieter. It simply changed temperature, as if the air had thickened, and the walls leaned in to listen. Mason set his glass down with a soft thud, his expression shedding every trace of the polite mildness he'd worn all evening. He stood straighter, studying me with a gravity that hadn't been there moments before. He asked if I was Captain Georgia Harmon from Sector Detroit. All conversations around us stopped. The stillness spread like a shockwave, heads turning, eyes widening, silence pooling at our feet. My mother stared at him, then at me, her face tightening with confusion she couldn't mask. I told him yes. What happened next tore through the room. Mason snapped to attention, heels together, and raised his hand in a crisp salute. The transformation was instantaneous. The seals near him straightened in unison, reflex trained into bone. A woman gasped and dropped her glass. Annie covered her mouth, eyes wide as if witnessing something impossible. My mother's voice broke into a whisper, asking what was happening as though the truth couldn't exist in front of her. Mason lowered his hand and spoke with the conviction of a man repeating doctrine. The Great Lakes rescue I'd led was used in training at Coronado, and he had never realized I was the one behind the radio transmissions they studied. An older retired admiral stepped forward, greeting me by rank and name, extending his hand with the kind of respect that silenced even the boldest voices in the room. The murmurs grew louder until someone quietly searched my name and read aloud that I had saved 27 lives. The people who had chuckled earlier pulled their hands back, straightened their posture, and avoided meeting my eyes. Mason apologized softly for underestimating me when we first met. I told him I was used to it. It wasn't resignation, it was truth forged from years of being overlooked. As the room shifted around me, the memories of that storm surged back, the freezing spray, the chaos, the voices calling for help. None of those people here knew what that night had taken out of me. But for the first time in my life, the people who had always stood above me were forced to recalibrate. For once, I did not have to shrink so others could stay comfortable. The room adjusted to me instead. The instant Mason lowered his hand, the entire ballroom froze. Moments earlier, it had been full of soft laughter, clinking glasses, and the warm glow of chandeliers. Now everything felt suspended, as if the air itself had been startled still. They weren't shocked because of my rank. They were shocked because the story they'd always believed about me dissolved in front of them. My mother stared at me, blinking rapidly, struggling to match the woman she'd reshaped for years with the one standing before her. Her voice trembled when she finally asked if I was a captain. I didn't answer. There was no way to compress 20 years of dismissal into a single explanation. Then the retired admiral stepped forward, addressing me by rank and stating that my mission reports were used for training. His voice carried across the room like a second command, redirecting every gaze toward me. When I shook his hand, my mother stiffened, realizing nothing she'd said about me was true anymore. 3 SEALs snapped to attention behind Mason, their reaction instinctive, their posture flawless. Seeing that level of discipline appear in the middle of a Southern engagement party felt surreal. Guests shifted uneasily, caught between awe and guilt. Mason's mother approached with an unsteady apology, and when I told her it was fine, the words seemed to ricochet toward my own mother, leaving her visibly shaken. But it was Mason's voice that cracked the night open. He turned to Annie and asked why she never told him her sister was the one who saved 27 people in a blizzard, the mission every trainee studied. Annie's fingers tightened around her glass as if the world had tipped beneath her feet. For the first time, she wasn't the center of the room. My mother took my hand and asked why I'd never told her. I stayed silent. I had told her, just never in a way she cared to hear. Then my phone vibrated. A message from district headquarters warned of a possible suspension and ordered me to report immediately. While the room finally saw me clearly, the one institution that always had might slip away. I closed the phone with a steady smile. Even as dread pooled in my stomach, the real storm hadn't even begun. The attention that followed felt suffocating. People crowded around, eager to ask questions, eager to align themselves with the version of me they had ignored minutes earlier. Praise became its own weight. pressing into the same space where the words possible suspension echoed relentlessly. Mason noticed my hands trembling and asked what was wrong. I brushed it off, but he didn't believe me. Before he could say more, Annie pulled him aside, insisting I was simply overwhelmed by attention. Her tone carried that familiar softness sharpened into a blade. Mason's expression shifted for the first time all night. The commander pulled me into the hallway and asked directly about the investigation. His concern made my stomach drop. Politics claimed people like me all the time. When my phone buzzed again, the meeting had been moved to dawn. I would have to leave Charleston within hours. I returned to the ballroom long enough to tell Annie I needed to go. Her response was immediate, another accusation that I put work above family. The words stung deeper than she knew. I told her it wasn't work. It was truth. Then I walked out into the night, leaving behind the people who had only just begun to see me, and the family who still didn't know how. The road north waited, along with the storm that would decide everything. I left Charleston just before midnight, the sky a heavy shade of violet stretching endlessly ahead. No one walked me out. No goodbye. No embrace. Not even the simplest question of when I might return. My mother's confusion lingered in the doorway, and Annie's expression hovered somewhere between bruised pride and uncertainty. As if my leaving pulled her out of the center of her own celebration, the highway swallowed me quickly. I-26 was nearly empty, its scattered yellow lights blurring into long, tired streaks across the road. I drove with my shoulders tight, feeling the darkness around me echo the uncertainty inside. When I rolled the window down, the cold air struck my face sharply, nothing like the warm, curated glow of the party I had escaped hours earlier. In Charleston, they had finally seen me. Hours later, I was racing north with the threat of suspension pounding through my ribs. Two worlds pulling hard in opposite directions, the family that never understood me, and the career that suddenly felt as though someone else controlled the ground beneath it. The call from district came first. My presence required at 0500, the situation more serious than expected. Then came the memories, the black churn of the storm. The split-second decision of Vector 29827, lives depending on a choice I now had to defend. Messages followed Mason offering support I couldn't accept. Annie delivering a familiar wound I no longer had the strength to answer. By the time the faint lavender of dawn edged over the Michigan border, I pressed harder on the accelerator. The real storm waited ahead, and this time, I would walk into it alone. The conference room at District Detroit glowed under harsh white lights, the kind that revealed everything and left nowhere to hide. The polished table reflected the ceiling panels, and the map of the Great Lakes pinned to the wall pulled my memories back to the night I was here to defend. I walked in wearing my duty uniform, the fabric still carrying the faint chill of the lake air from my overnight drive. Dust clung to my boots, proof of how quickly I'd come. The panel waited 3 senior officers, a JAG representative, and 2 investigators, each watching with the calm severity of people trained to dissect the truth. Here, I didn't shrink. I didn't fold inward the way I did in Charleston. Here, I stood straight. Here, I belonged. The junior officer rose first, voice unsteady as he accused me of issuing an unsafe vector. The room turned to me, not with suspicion but expectation. I opened my laptop and laid out the evidence radar showing the ice drift, diagrams proving the collision risk, the logbook bearing his signature, and then the radio recording. His own voice filled the room, confirming the path was clear. His face drained of color as the last shield of his lie vanished. The JAG representative delivered the verdict I had followed SARE protocol. The report would be corrected. No grounds for suspension. A senior officer met my eyes and said he knew I always acted with reason, that I had saved lives and saved them correctly. I stood still, lighter than I had in months. When I stepped outside into the Michigan sun, the silver on my shoulder caught the light. The storm behind me was done. Now came the storm waiting at home. A week after the investigation ended, I drove back to Nebraska with a quiet mind I hadn't felt in months. I wasn't coming for apologies, nor to offer any. I came to draw a line where one had never been drawn. The old house looked the same as it always had: warped windows, worn carpet, The scar on the wooden table from when I was 13. My mother was cutting vegetables when I walked in. She looked at me longer than she ever had, as if finally seeing everything she'd missed. We sat at the table. I told her I wasn't angry anymore, but I wouldn't shrink myself to keep the peace. Her hands trembled as she admitted she'd tried to protect Annie's confidence by keeping me small. I understood. That was enough. At Annie's wedding. She hugged me with both arms this time. No audience, no competition, just sisters, back in Michigan, standing by the lake at sunrise. I read her message thanking me for never leaving her. I smiled. Peace didn't come from being understood. It came from no longer needing to be. And finally, I was exactly where I belonged. 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 Exactly where I belonged.